Humanitarians are, we're not separate from the international community, the politics and the geopolitics. And as a result, we need to, stand up to those who ignore international law. And we have to be seen as a force of good in this very grim global geopolitical landscape. My name is Jimmy McGoldrick. I'm a former Humanitarian Coordinator with the United Nations. I've worked previously with the international NGOs and International Red Cross Red Crescent movement for over the last 30 years plus. My most recent experience was as Humanitarian Coordinator in Palestine last year, where I witnessed some of the changes that are unfolding in the current humanitarian system, and as a sector how we cannot shy away from these issues and take them on board. I think what's beyond dispute that there is only political solutions. There are no humanitarian solutions. We are not there for that. However, that said, I think the world is changing and the humanitarian system is struggling to keep up with the increased conflicts and the types of conflicts and the impact of climate disaster. We also see political instability and economic collapse are now requiring some sort of humanitarian response as well. And the humanitarian aid is used systematically to restore some degree of basic stability, but I think the meaningful efforts at state building, at conflict resolution, mediation, and they face unsurmountable political and operational challenges and barriers. So I think it's unsustainable and unfair to expect the humanitarian system to continue to fill all these gaps. The burden of response to conflict and climate change and economic crisis is falling on the humanitarians. I think it's not sustainable. There are other pressures and threats on the current humanitarian system, and I think what they're doing, they're exposing the frailties and highlighting that it might not be the right fit as a system, or it might not be the right design now for modern conflict. Things have moved on. I think we see increasing pressures and risks, and they include the politicisation of aid has increased over the last decade plus. There's more and more access problems in conflicts, and these are increasing, and the respect for international humanitarian refugee laws is waning by states and non-state actors. And funding is less, there's maybe more misaligned to needs than ever before. And I think at the same time, it doesn't support local action in any meaningful way. And I think that all this is happening in a context where wars are becoming more common in place and much more difficult to end for lots of reasons. I think the changing nature of conflict is there, that the 21st century wars tend to be fought between states and armed groups committed to different causes with access to relatively advanced weaponry and technology that we've seen, and as well as money earned from natural resource and other exploitation and other criminal activity. And I think that the UN itself as an institution was once the sort of the go-to mediator. I think it's been very, very often sidelined, and the UN's loss of influence, I think, has been driven by this rising geopolitical competition, which has divided powerful states. And we see this quite clearly in the Security Council, which is particularly affected by these forces. And I think what you've got is a logjam where it's seized up, and you have the council plagued by growing international rivalries and tensions between especially the permanent five members, and it's now become an increasingly transactional approach to international politics. And I think the deadlock at the Security Council means that the UN can neither offer solutions or censure for war crimes or aggression anymore. And in some cases, we find it even difficult to get a humanitarian resolution passed for a ceasefire and a crisis or a conflict or a pause. And the divisions of the Security Council mean the UN is no longer able to, I think, achieve its ultimate goal of peacekeeping and peacemaking. And they can't devise, as before, durable political solutions, and instead they go for intermediate goals such as keeping or preserving ceasefires. I think that the ambition of many international mediation efforts are limited to bilateral deal-making designed to achieve short-term détentes or limited goals, such as we saw in the 2022, the Ukrainian crisis, where Ukrainian grain was allowed to pass through the Black Sea. But that was brokered by humanitarians and not by politicians or diplomats. And I think what we see increasingly is that war and conflict are fast becoming go-to solutions and options away from mediation and diplomacy. And I think the economic and social environmental trends are coming together, are gravitating to the same place. And you see resource competition and climate change, and then the lack of resources leading to political conflict. And state fragility continues to be part of that. And it's a key source for internal conflicts, instability, and obviously with that human suffering. And as a result, I think the world is plagued now with more wars than at any other time in generations. And for the most part, policymakers are less able, I think, to resolve them. And I think even when they do get some resolution, the deals that are struck are less likely to hold. I mean, peace deals take 5 or 6 times before you can get one that sticks. I think ceasefires, de-escalation, or frozen and low-intensity conflicts are now regarded as a form of peace, was not the case before. And war is being managed through humanitarian action as part of a protracted crisis, and the peace process itself as such is unable or unwilling to deliver anything resembling something that people really need for stability. And the worst thing, climate crisis is also escalating severity and regularity of the disasters we're facing right now. Is increasing community vulnerability, both the natural hazards and the conflict crisis, and therefore is worsening the ability for us to have humanitarian response. And you have these situations where you've got war, conflict layered on top of natural disasters such as floods and famine, floods and drought in places like Somalia and Pakistan. The climate crisis and disasters are increasingly being seen in politicised and conflict context as well. And that complicates the access, and especially at a time when needs are increased, and it makes it more difficult for us to operate. We saw that in places where lack of access was given in a natural disaster because of the framework was a conflict situation. And globally, we find ourselves, I think, at a savage inflection point in geopolitical terms, and I think as a humanitarian system affects us, and part of the multilateralism which is under threat. Anyway, and I think especially we see that in the UN. We operate in a time, as humanitarians, that we see starkly in more places with excessive violation of international humanitarian law, the blatant disregard for global norms and obligations. And I think a lack of respect for global institutions, not just the Security Council, but I think International Criminal Court and the ICJ. And at a time when we see outright attacks on UN agencies and by member states, and UN agencies being demonised, and the Secretary General being criticised for comments made, for example, at the start of the war in Gaza, and then calls for him to be persona non grata as well. And UNRWA, the biggest organisation, the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza, has now been sort of demonised by the Israeli government through the Knesset, and the legislation passed that's been prevented from delivering assistance by Israel, a UN member state and a party to the conflict. And I think what we see happening in Gaza, I think, is happening in Gaza is a game changer for the international community and for obviously humanitarians as well, and will have ramifications beyond the Middle East, and will affect the work that we try and do as a sector in other places as well. So the UN and the humanitarian system have been dealt, I think, a series of blows in the Gaza conflict that I think will impact our work with states and non-state actors. I think, putting it bluntly, the international community and the UN and the work of international community advocacy is now easily to be ignored. And the global norms and principles that were acted as guardrails can now be thrown aside or bypassed. And institutions that we relied on for some legal framework and accountability, I think, are no longer as viable or trusted, and are certainly leaking credibility because of the lack of support that some member states are willing to give them. And all of these trends have intensified over the years, but I think they've come to a much darker place since the horrific attacks by Hamas, the 7th of October. And then what followed in Gaza showed that, and what's unfolding right now, and I saw it myself, is that in crises like Sudan and Ukraine, we are witnessing the most tragic of conflicts and seemingly endless or without end. And in these places, it turns out to be the worst time to be a child, to be a health worker, to be a humanitarian, or to be a journalist working in these conflicts. And all of that, I think, is sort of coalesced around what's happened in Gaza and since Gaza. The negative changes in modern conflict, I think, have dramatically impacted our ability to protect civilians as well as the safety of humanitarian workers. And we see the attack on healthcare workers and health premises, the blatant disregard for legal frameworks and international humanitarian law, the lack of accountability, this creeping normalisation of violations. And that's part, I think, of the operating landscape for humanitarians. And we see more and more crises where there's a control, a limited amount of access being allowed for humanitarians despite the obligations that are there, and the visas are being denied and aid is redirected. These become part of the humanitarian landscape we work in. And we have, for example, a UN organisation, UNRWA, which was created by the UN General Assembly, is declared a terrorist organisation by another UN member state and preventing it from delivering assistance. At the same time, that member state is unwilling to take on its responsibilities and obligations as an occupying power. And I saw massive deterioration of a rule-based order, and in the Gaza context, and with the critique of the UN, and when I was the Humanitarian Coordinator. And I think what we saw was that operationally Israeli controlled all the access, the movements, the life-saving responses, at the same time caused immense and unprecedented suffering for humanity, for populations, and destruction of infrastructure and housing and schools on an industrial scale, with 40,000 plus people killed, nearly mostly women and children, and we don't know the exact numbers yet. And we built a deconfliction system, which was a way for interface with the parties in the conflict and to allow for humanitarian response. And it was an ability to communicate and contact. But however, we saw a catalogue of failures of the system, resulting in attacks on staff, on vehicles, on the number of humanitarian workers who died, the humanitarian warehouses and schools. And I think we're seeing this happening in front of our very eyes in real time in social media. And as a humanitarian system, we don't have the luxury to hope things will get better, I think. I think moving forward, we know the geopolitical landscape is bleak. There is, and I think as little as we can do as humanitarians fundamentally to affect the change in that because of it. But I think there are steps we can take to make the system better, more effective, more efficient. And as a system, I have to make greater strides to address not the changes, but actually what we can do to work within that space. And I think to protect our ability to serve people in need. We know for a decade plus there's been a lot of hand-wringing over putting people at the centre of the crisis, of the response, and for localisation. But in many ways, this has been a bit of a fake composite or a fake response to this changing landscape. There's been no real substantive increase in the funding going to local and national actors, and these actors still exert very little genuine influence over the design, the delivery, and the coordination of humanitarian response in their communities and in their crisis. And I think this is part of this ongoing hegemony of international actors who run the clusters, the sectors, the response, and the humanitarian country team, and that needs to change. I think there's probably going to be less collaboration in these settings as organisations scramble for the dwindling humanitarian resources that are there. In face of the growing humanitarian needs, there'll be more competition rather than collaboration. And despite the talk of diversification of funding base since the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit, the bulk of the funds continue to come from North America and Europe, and still goes to the largest UN agencies and international organisations. And it basically reinforces the perception that the humanitarian system is a Western neo-colonial construct. And I think that this perception is keenly felt in crisis by local and national organisations. They see themselves in the communities that are affected at the front line doing the work, but they don't get the recognition, the support. There are barriers against inclusion. National organisations feel excluded, ignored or marginalised. as actors, individuals. And in effect, the largest UN agencies and NGOs still dominate all the clusters and coordination structures. And they then, for that, dictate the rules and makes it extremely difficult for new people, new groups and new entrants to join this club. And the perception that national actors are viewed as implementing partners and not really as genuine strategic or equal partners, that's something that has to change. And this has to change beyond just lip service, as we keep talking about increasing localisation, having local partners. People at the heart of crisis, those impacted most, need to call the shots on how the scarce resources we have and how that funding is spent. And as a sector, we need to stop getting hung up on localisation. It really isn't a policy issue, it's a political issue, and we have to change it. And despite the decades of talking about putting people at the centre of response, we make very little progress. I mean, the amount of money that goes to national actors in places like Ukraine and Sudan is minimal in comparison. National organisations feel unheard, they feel poorly served, and they're not getting the support they need. The system needs to be more focused on flipping the script from the supply to a demand-led aid system, starting from the priorities of the communities in places where we are responding. We need to dispense with the meaningless rhetoric of putting people at the centre of the crisis and actually put them there, actually go about doing that. And as a system, we need to catch up. Localisation, local actors are not waiting. They're not standing by waiting for us. They know what's happening. They've got new technology, new communication technology, media platforms they're using, and they're challenging their priorities, and ultimately they will come and challenge the authority of aid organisations. And as a result, I think many of these local community aid initiatives are tired of waiting for the international promises to materialise, of putting them at the centre of action. And you have to look no further than somewhere like Sudan. And as the war and the famine tears the communities apart, local NGOs such as the emergency response rooms are doing it themselves. They're contributing to building, or not even because of the war, they were there before, but they're actually turned their hands to response, building bottom-up institutions that are representative and responsive to the needs of the citizens, which they are part of the social fabric. These groups are building trust and seeking to prevent further damage to Sudan's social fabric. And they're funded for the most part by diaspora donations and by crowdsourcing. And while for the most part, I think a lot of the big international organisations have limited presence in key conflict areas in Sudan, some of them are in the neighbouring countries, some of them in Darfur, but there are others who are not present, and a lot of them based out of Port Sudan. So we need to shift the dial and help communities take matters into their own hands and not be solely dependent on international donors or subject to the terms and the threats of warring parties. We have to give them space and support themselves. We need to resource and empower these local organisations and local NGOs. And donors need to help by, I think, reducing as well some of the unrealistic demands on the monitoring and evaluation of the last mile assurances in the height of a conflict. You can't guarantee in a conflict when the conflict is so alive. And also, I think there's a lot of very restrictive donor conditions on, anti-terrorism, counter-terrorism legislation that's built into the funding sometimes, and it makes it difficult and sometimes impossible to select new local partners and to expand the operations. And I think at the same time, the duty of care and the safety and security conditions placed on international staff has made it much more, as a system, much more risk averse, and as a sector. And because of that, the national staff and the national organisations are the ones put at risk, but we're not giving them the authority and the power to carry that out. So I think we need to find ways of connecting to frontline partners and giving them the empowerment they need. And the reluctance to embrace a more fully and giving more control and autonomy to national actors is happening at a time globally when staff cuts and financial turbulence is taking place with very big humanitarian organisations recently, because governments in the West who fund normally humanitarians are cutting their budgets. There's a global funding squeeze on humanitarian finances, and multiple donors are now starting to tighten their belts because they're spending more money at home on refugee issues and calling that humanitarian assistance. Now, a different type of engagement with affected communities, I think, is needed. We need to get away from the humanitarian ones where you needs assess and you respond and you come back year in, year out. We need to get more at being how we do it in terms of development approach, where you go in there and you build capacities. You work with development actors, you work with climate adaptation actors. And I think that we know from experience this it helps to build the resistance and the resilience and the absorptive capacity of communities for future shocks, rather than the humanitarian going in 10 years in a row doing the same thing, and the funds get limited and your ability to respond gets less. There needs to be a much more forward-looking change, a rethinking of the roles of the international organisations, such as the UN agencies and the international NGOs. We have to be much more, I think, normative, much more strategic, smaller and nimble, in the back room facilitating, rather than at the front line power broking and resource controlling and being the gatekeepers of these big responses, such as the cluster system. We have to change that. Because, the unwillingness for meaningful change in the humanitarian system at present needs to be replaced with some sort of idea of, you can change things and make it better. And it might mean that you have to change in terms of your footprint or your size or your cut of the pie. Because as a system, the more we squeeze to try and keep the current situation as status quo, the more the system's credibility will be lost or diminishes. And then when we talk about empowering local actors, it's more than just a plan to improve partnership. We need to listen to affected communities and put control and resources, and with that power to bring about change into their hands. And we as a humanitarian sector must stop doing active harm to communities. Communities have to, who are already shouldering the majority of the first line response, they have to be protected better. I mean, we raised those issues in the lessons from 2004 tsunami response. So it's not really just a moral argument, it's more of an effective efficiency argument now. The current humanitarian system can no longer justify the old thinking, the old model of supporting people through a crisis until some sort of normality returns. Because we know, like in today's world, with the conflicts that are there, the complexities, the crisis, the overload, and the climate change issues, there's no more real expected normality. People's situation throughout the world is getting steadily worse as the climate crisis and a less principled, more inward-looking political situation geopolitically, they all come together. And it will have a profound effect on the ability for us to respond, because the funding will be cut. It will be spent inside countries themselves, more insular rather than externally for international assistance. And I think that's going to be a big impact on us. And so I think that we have to go quicker to get the localisation to be much more impactful and much more steadied on the ground. So I think localisation is increasingly critical in the face of the shrinking global funding and the growing humanitarian needs driven by those factors, the climate change, the conflict, the economic stability and global health pandemics. And I think it's vital that the resources are increased and the barriers are removed to direct local funding, and a comprehensive shift in power and ownership to the partner countries and to the communities is needed. Because in an era of Gaza and Lebanon, Sudan, Sahel, Congo, whatever comes next, there'll be no longer any real choice. The responsibility is to reflect what people on the front line of crisis are telling us. They want to have more say and more control of their lives. And why shouldn't they have that? As humanitarian system, we want to continue to opt for status quo, to maintain our size and our shape. And perhaps the needs of the system, in many ways, our system outstrips, or we see it as outstripping the needs of the people themselves. And as a system that has increasingly become more bureaucratic and more risk averse, more complex, compliance heavy and clunky in many ways, it's not the way forward. Humanitarians are, we're not separate from the international community, the politics and the geopolitics. And as a result, we need to, stand up for those who ignore international law. And we have to be seen as a force of good in this very grim global geopolitical landscape. And I think that we have to push member states who are funding us. We have to work with them harder and challenge them more because they've got a duty to try harder to try and put politics under and not over humanity. And so I think their political interests have to take second place, but I'm just dreaming here. The humanitarian system and its leaders, including the international donors, I think must fight to improve the way we respond to protect the vulnerable and save lives. That's for sure. But we also have to call out the impunity and the lack of accountability and the injustices that are out there are very stark at the moment, and hold member states and parties to account as part of the humanitarian system. We just can't pretend to be humanitarians. We're living in a much more globally complex world.